Hi, my name's Paddy Hirsch. I'm a senior editor at Marketplace. Today I want to talk about bad banks. The reason? Because the Federal Reserve has decided that bad banks could be a possible solution to the problems that we're having in the financial system right now. Also, banks themselves are creating bad banks, these entities, as a way to take some pressure off their balance sheets. So what is a bad bank and how does it actually work? Well, let's start with a metaphor. And the metaphor is of an Antarctic explorer. So here's our guy, and he's about to set out across the ice cap, and he's got an enormous rucksack on his back, packed with all of the latest state-of-the-art gear. He's got radios and sleeping bags and cooking stoves and ice axes and all the rest of the stuff that he needs for an Antarctic expedition, but quite a lot of it is surplus anyway. He's weighed down, and everything's fine when the sun's shining and the weather is good. He can toddle along quite nicely, but whenever the weather starts to deteriorate, he's got a bit of a problem, because he's found that he's overburdened, he's got too much stuff, and he's going to have to strip himself down to the necessities. So what does he do? Well, first thing he might try to do is to sell some of his gear off or offload some of his gear to his buddies on the expedition, but they don't want his stuff because they're already burdened down themselves. So what is the other option he's got is to leave it on the ice cap. Of course, he doesn't want to ditch it, so what he does is he creates a little igloo, a little cache, to put the gear inside. This is a great idea. It takes the pressure off him, and it gives him a nice little storage area that he can go back to later on to pick up his very expensive state-of-the-art gear. And this leaves him. Excellent situation, much smaller rucksack, much happier, able to stroll along through the problems that they're having with the weather and able to make it out the other end. Of course, he's a little diminished when he gets to the other end because the people at the receiving party say, "Hey, what happened to you?" So, I had to leave a bunch of my gear on the ice cap. Bit of a red face there. Not so good. Anyway. How does this relate to the banks? Well, if we think about a bank as one of these expeditioneers, the banks started off, say over the last few years, they loaded up their balance sheets, they loaded up their systems with all sorts of exotic instruments, everything from CDOs to SIVs and CDS and CLOs, you name it, whatever they are, it loaded up with this stuff. And it found that as the economy deteriorated and problems in the financial system started to get worse, that these things were really getting rather heavy, in fact getting rather toxic, potentially toxic, certainly toxic to them if they held on to them because they were going to drag them down. So what do? Well, they've tried to sell off these assets to their compatriots, and in some cases they've been successful, but in most cases the other banks have said we don't want anything to do with this stuff, and the markets in them has dried up. Either that or they're trading at exceptional discounts, to 25 cents on the dollar, in many cases a quarter of the value. So selling off, trying to get rid of them and get it to other members in the expedition, if you like, has failed. So what we're looking at now is the creation of what they're calling bad banks. And bad banks are essentially like these igloos on the ice. What they are is a separate entity that's created. Now, in the case of this expedition here, or this bank, and this happened earlier last year with UBS, is UBS decided to create an entity that was part of the overall holding company, but not actually part of the bank. Okay, so it created this entity, and it allowed UBS to take all of the bad assets, or potentially bad assets, and load them into this what's called a bad bank. All right. And the reason it's called a bad bank is because the assets in it are potentially bad. Okay. But that left UBS unencumbered and able to carry on as a bank with a much lighter balance sheet. Of course, the issue is that in order to put the assets into the bad bank, it had to write them down. So there's a considerable hole in UBS's balance sheet. It made some big losses, but at the very least, it managed to get this stuff off its balance sheet so that it wouldn't drag them down any further. So inside the bad bank are a bunch of assets that have been placed in there at a significant discount to their original face value. Okay. And that's the way that the banks actually manage to unencumber themselves and continue on, and that's why they're like this particular expeditioneer. But in the case that we're seeing that was announced this week is where the Fed is talking about creating bad banks. Now this is slightly different because it's not the entity creating the bank creating its own subsidiary bank, if you like. It's the Fed creating these bad banks. How is it going to do that? Well, it means that good old Uncle Sam, there he is, his beard, is going to go out and he's going to take a bunch of our money, he's going to give it to these banks, a nice big bunch of money, and then these bad banks created, are going to go out and they're going to buy assets from our expeditioneers, that is to say the banks. They're going to go out and they're going to buy assets, the bad assets from the banks, so they can be placed in this receptacle. And hopefully over time, as the economy improves, the value of these assets will improve, and the bad bank will be able to sell them off at a marked increase in value to what they bought it from the banks at. So that's the theory. That's what's supposed to happen in theory. And the great thing about it is, it takes pressure off these banks, it allows them to clean up their balance sheet, and it gives us, the taxpayer, the opportunity to make some money on the deal. The other thing, of course, that Uncle Sam can do is he can take these bad banks, call them individual companies, and sell shares off. So, an enterprising hedge fund or private equity company or other type of investor might say to himself, that bad bank looks like it might have some potential over the next 5 years. I'm going to invest in it. I might buy equity in the bad bank, and that's another way of raising money. So the two ways that these bad banks will be capitalized are firstly by money from you and I, and secondly by shares sold to outside investors. Of course, this could work the other way. The economy could indeed improve, but the economy, on the other hand, may continue to go down. These toxic assets, or potentially toxic assets, they're marked down right now, and they can be very cheap or considered very cheap in some circumstances. There's a possibility that they could rise up, but on the other hand, they could continue to descend. They could go all the way to zero, and in many cases, in the case of some of the CDOs, people reckon they will go all the way to zero, and they'll never be worth anything. If that's the case, if too much of the content that's in these bad banks goes south, it means that the taxpayer is going to be left, having made a loss on this deal. That's going to leave all of us very badly, needing a drink.